And what exactly are you seeing? I mean, after 3 years of doing Zoom meetings, you'd think I'd have it all together, but I don't. Like, are you seeing my presentation?
We are. Yes.
Great. All right. Well, I do want to give this a caveat that every time I've looked at this over the last couple of weeks, I've started to cry. So just
Sure.
warning you that might happen, but not to worry. It'll be fine. So yeah, I was a Peace Corps volunteer from 2012 to 2014. I went there, I joined the Peace Corps when I was 47, a little bit of a midlife crisis, I would call it. As the majority of Peace Corps volunteers are either quite young in their 20s or newly retired in their 60, kind of 65, 66, 67 range. So I was kind of in the middle. I got to live in both worlds, which was actually pretty nice. But I went to Ukraine. I wanted to go to the mud hut in Africa, but they asked me to go to Ukraine, which I don't know if I would have survived the mud hut in Africa now that I think about it. But yeah, so that is, and we can certainly talk more about that. But just to kind of give you a recap, this team probably knows, but the Peace Corps has 3 goals. The first one is to help the people of the interested countries in meeting their need for trained men and women. As Jane probably has alluded to in the past, Peace Corps gets invited to come to a country. We want to help promote a better understanding of Americans on the part of the people served, and then to help promote a better understanding of other peoples on the part of Americans. So it's part of what I'm doing today is to help you understand Ukraine and Ukrainians a little bit better. So a few fast facts here. So about 240,000 Americans have served as Peace Corps volunteers in 142 countries. When the pandemic started, they brought everybody home and they're starting to move back. So the latest statistics I could find were in 2019, but 63 countries, 6,900 volunteers. The top field is in education. Just kind of a few fun facts there. Volunteers over the age of 50, only 7%. So you can kind of see where we fall into where I fell into the mix there. And this is what my house looked like the day that I left. That is what I brought over to Ukraine to live for 2 years. Everything else either went into storage or went on the big garage sale. And I turned my house, I live in Highland Park in Saint Paul. I turned my house into a rental and packed up to leave. So that was my parting shot back in March of 2012. I was the 43rd group of people to go to Ukraine. There were 65 people in my group. We all converged into Washington, D.C. for a day of orientation, and then we flew over to Kyiv. We arrived on March 14th, and I actually served as a community development volunteer. I'll talk a little bit about that here in a second, but that was my role. Most of the people were education, youth development, and I'm not sure if there was another, that might have been it. Those were the 3 fields that we worked in Ukraine. And so a little bit, I think it's important to have a context of Ukraine. So it has really been striving for its independence for centuries. If you go online and you probably can get a Google of the different boundaries that made up Ukraine over the centuries. They've been part of the Austria-Hungary, they kind of have been carved up over the years, but, so they really have been in transition. They've only been an independent state since 1991, so only 31 years. So if you think about, America in 1776 and what it was like in 1810, or 1805, they still really are growing. And Peace Corps was invited right away. They've been there since 1992. So, they're still struggling as a new nation, more so than anything. This is a map. This map happens to be a breakdown of people, what they would like their native language. So the yellow people's native tongue is Ukrainian, and the blue is their native tongue is Russian. This little yellow starburst here is where I was stationed for the 2 years. I lived in Donetsk. So I learned Russian. Well, I tried to learn Russian, let's just be honest. But yeah, so this will kind of come to play here as we go to these lines of demarcation as things came about. So this is my Russian teacher and my Peace Corps teacher. Her name is Tamilia. We had 10 weeks of intensive training on language, culture, and technical skills. This up top says, I learned to speak Russian. Я начинаю говорить по-русски. Is how you'd say that, the Cyrillic alphabet. We had a group of, there were 4 of us that spent probably 8 to 10 hours a day with this lady for 10 weeks to try to immerse us in the culture and the language of the places where we were going to be serving. That was brutal and very humbling, I have to say. I don't know, many of you probably, if you were exchange students, you probably learned the language. I took a little bit of French in high school, so I didn't have a basis of a second language. And so it was extremely difficult to learn. Some of the younger kids, they picked up on their Ukrainian or Russian right away and were fluent almost within the 10, 12 weeks that they learned. So very humbling. This is the view of my flat in Donetsk. So when I moved there, it was, I guess it was turning the spring. So this would have been in the winter, but this was the view outside of my window. You can kind of see the Soviet era apartment complexes that we lived in. But that was the view outside of my window. And this was the view inside my flat. So the 2 folks on the right here in the red and the green, those were Peace Corps volunteers that lived in my neighborhood. And then the 2 on the right were some Ukrainians that we befriended. One was a professor. The gentleman was a professor at a local university, and his wife. So I had them over for dinner one night, which was fun. And this is the group that I was embedded with or assigned to. So my main goal as a community development volunteer was this was a nonprofit called Allianz. And they were, nonprofits there, they really chased the grant money. So if there was a grant, they decided that they were that they wanted to be in that business, and they would apply for the grant and figure it out as they go. And so one of the things that we were asked to do is to try to get them to kind of focus on a mission, and be more sustainable so that they weren't chasing grant money all of the time. So one of the things that I did was, we developed marketing seminars. We would present them to other nonprofits in Ukraine, all throughout Ukraine, actually, and talk to them about, marketing, business planning, trying to get them to kind of think about their, what business am I in, instead of I'm in whatever business the grant wants me to be in. This particular organization did a lot of work around civil society building. And then obviously, like anything, a huge amount of what we did was around cultural exchange. This picture, I think, was actually on the 4th of July. They wanted to have a 4th of July party. So we all wore red, white, and blue and had a barbecue, which was fun. The other thing that I did when I was over there was English clubs. So I had three. I did one at the local library. I did one at a local language school. And then also there was a consulting firm that had tapped into me as well. A lot of the offshore, similar to sending business to India, a lot of offshore consulting firms had consultants and technology resources in Ukraine and Eastern Europe. And so they wanted to learn to get better at their English. And so I would visit them once a week. And I didn't really teach English because, quite frankly, I don't know English grammar, but we would just visit, and I would, help them practice their English, and just speak with a native speaker was helpful. At the language school, I had very high performing students. A lot of them, one of them worked for Caterpillar, one worked for another company with a large English presence, and one was actually a translator. So she wanted to know all about like the idioms that we used, and she was constantly taking notes about the way I talked and the different languages and phrases that she had, because she served as a translator when I was there. And then subsequently, when the war broke out in 2014, she was embedded with Al Jazeera and helped them with their translations. And now with this most recent one, she was working for Vice News out of New York City. And she was there. So she is active. She just relocated to, I think she just moved to Ireland, but she was recently there in that. So that was kind of a little bit of the kind of work that I did. And I think that I took a few slides here to kind of give you a little bit of information on the history of Ukraine. So they're a very beat up country, for lack of a better term, and for centuries, they have really been have really been beat up, for lack of a better term. So under the Russian Empire, Catherine the Great, who, was one of the czars, she introduced serfdom, so kind of made everybody slaves, and, put in a policy of Russification. So they suffered under that. During Soviet times, back in 1932 or 33, I had never heard of this until I was there, but back in 1932 and 1933, there was something called the Holodomor, which was death by hunger. So you might have heard Ukraine be the breadbasket of Europe. Lots of agriculture, tons of grain is farmed there. Well, when Stalin was starting to make collective farms, so you don't own your own farm, it's part of the collective, and you get your quota just like everybody else. The farmers were like, yeah, no, I don't really want to do that. I'm kind of good with how things are going. Well, then he just started taking their grain away and would give them, fewer and fewer, less and less grain, so that they basically starved them so that they could take their farms and become part of the collective. And then, kind of layered on top of that, they did have, some crop failures at the time and things like that, which just made a really bad situation worse. But here's this farmland that's, the rich and fertile farmland, and there's 5 to 7 million Ukrainians that die of hunger because of the way the Soviet mentality was of, taking the grain away from these farmers and delivering it to whoever they wanted to, actually. So that, was a horrible thing. And what we learned, one of the cultural things that we learned in our training was that bread is sacred there. And you don't waste food at all, but you do not waste bread. So you never throw any away. And if, like, the people, my host family that I stayed with during training, they would cut the bread, they wouldn't throw anything away. But even the crumbs, they would brush the crumbs off, and they would feed those to the birds. So it was like there was no part of bread that ever got wasted. And what they said was, even during the worst of times, during this Holodomor, they at least had bread. And so it's that grounding, the grounding factor for them. And something that was, even to this day, I find myself, I don't throw breadcrumbs away, even here. I'll like wipe them off and, put them outside for hopefully the squirrels or something that I carried with me there. And then the Great Terror of 37 and 38, where political repression really, came on strong. So peasants were starting, to be repressed, police surveillance, suspicion of saboteurs, imprisonment, arbitrary executions. In Ukraine, over 250,000 were arrested. Half of them were shot to death. So that was 1937 and 38, not that long ago. During World War II, Ukraine was 100% occupied by the Nazis. There were 230 concentration camps in Ukraine. 8 million perished. 2.3 million were deported to Germany, and 714 cities and towns and 28,000 villages were completely flattened and destroyed. So they're kind of, getting beat up on a regular basis over the years. And then this is just, they were also behind the Iron Curtain, actually part of the USSR. So they had that. And this actually, so the Soviet legacy, a lot of the people that trained us, the Ukrainians that trained us, really drove this home. And so part of the Ukrainian legacy is, they instilled fear in people, a deep lack of trust, especially for the government, a ban on initiative, a ban on private property, a ban on critical thinking, civic engagement, just basic freedoms. And they really, this pessimism and lack of hope permeated the community. So if you think about this, and people have grown up with this, and they were taught this, and now you find yourself in this independent, you're an independent and free country, but yet not only have you never been able to make a decision, you were basically instructed not to, or you were punished if you made a decision, or if you, thought that you should have private property, or, really had any sort of critical thinking skills at all, or wanted to protest something that you felt strongly about, those things, from when you were little on, you didn't know. Like the head of my nonprofit organization could not decide what to put on a pizza. She just couldn't decide. And I'm like, you can't make a bad decision, Svetlana. All of it's going to be good. But they just were so unsure of themselves. That wasn't something that they felt comfortable doing. And so we did a lot of work around that in the work that I did, like marketing. They didn't understand that, they did not think that they had competition as a nonprofit organization. And so I was trying to explain to them, it's like, when other people are applying for the same grants that you do, that's competition. And it was just, it's a mindset that, really, having been told this, so I was aware of it, other things made so much more sense, because they just, like, the lack of trust in their government, they trusted their friends and their family. They didn't trust their government. So, they made decisions completely differently than we make decisions. Our perspective, like we have in America, we have more or less a basic trust in our government, and that things work a certain way and laws work a certain way, and they don't have that at all. And so when they're making, decisions and approaching life choices, they don't think about it that way at all. So like applying our knowledge and our culture onto their situation, it's just a fundamental disconnect, because, and when we were there, like the schools hadn't really changed their curriculum. And so kids, even now, aren't really learning, these things to bring into their future. But in 1991, they did get their independence when the Soviet Union collapsed. You'll see this picture on the left. This is a protest of the Orange Revolution in 2004 and 2005. So, they were a country for 10 years before the first revolution. You'll see this, pay attention to this little pillar here on the left. This is their main square in Kyiv. This Orange Revolution was fundamentally based on corruption. There were a couple of politicians that, they tried to steal the election, and so people were protesting. So this is, protest number one. You'll see people in the streets here. And this also, kind of when it comes to lack of trust in government and, not believing in, in the rule of law and all of that kind of stuff. These were stats. This white section was stats from, probably in 2000, what do I have a date here? 2014. So the corruption index, they were ranked 142nd out of 175 in the world for corruption. So pretty darn corrupt, with a score of 26 out of 100, 0 being completely corrupt, 100 being completely clean. So super bad scores. I mean, people had to pay bribes for everything. I had to pay bribes. We had basically more or less a residence permit that we had to renew every year. And they basically brought a brown paper bag, told me to buy a flask of whiskey, and, here's an envelope of money, here's a flask of whiskey. This is what you're going to need to go get your renewal for your, residence visa. They had to pay a bribe to get a driver's license. I mean, all the way down to the very lowest level of services, people had to pay bribes. So completely and utterly corrupt. Every president was worse than the next one. I mean, it was bad. And then life expectancy back then, 69 years of age. Mostly like men were really bad, and smoking, alcohol, high alcohol consumption, really high tobacco consumption. Not necessarily that great. As a matter of fact, Ukraine, I always used to say Ukraine was hard on the men. Like one of the men that was a Peace Corps volunteer, he was a Ukrainian. I thought he was like in his early 50s, and I found out he was 34. Yeah, so it was, and same thing, like one of the guys in my English club, I thought he was maybe 40 and he was like 25. I'm like, ooh, man, Ukraine does not treat you guys well. But I did I looked up the stats. I'm like, oh, I wonder how they're doing now. And in 2021, they were 122nd out of 180. So they were getting better, 32 out of 100. I mean, they were getting better. Life expectancy was getting better. They were on their way up, which I thought was super promising, because you know how hard it is to break a cycle of corruption. And here's like similar, so remember the language map? Now this is a political and cultural map. So same thing, like it's really a country that is trying to stay together, but very, very divided culturally and politically, which is just causing all kinds of problems. So in November 21 of 2014, this civil society awakening had started to happen. The crux of this particular issue when I was there was the current president was deciding between joining a EU trade association and kind of the equivalent that Putin was trying to do, which was a Russian customs union. So he was trying to get Ukraine and Belarus and I can't remember who else, but to kind of join a custom unions on his side, and then this trade association on the other side. You can probably figure out from here which side, who was on what side. So Lviv over here, very, very European city, right across the border from Hungary and Poland and Austria. They were very, very, very much wanting to join the EU trade association. And then, folks over here on this side were more aligned with the Russian customs union. A lot of pressure was put in place. He was supposed to join the EU Trade Association, and then he basically left the country, joined, I think the Russian said, and then left the country. But here are some pictures from the protests back then in 2014. So they're, the EU flag, and people were, and here's the EU flag too, really super excited about becoming closer to the EU. And so, more and more, so he didn't join the EU Trade Association. So December 1st, protesters are trying to get him to resign. The 16th, they started to pass anti-civil laws, so banning protests, banning things like that. The protest turned violent, really violent, starting on the 19th of January. And then there was supposedly a truce, around the January 27th to February 17th timeframe. Like during this time, so Peace Corps had I call them DEFCON levels. So there was a series of, one was kind of like just be aware of your surroundings. Then there was shelter in place and don't be out after dark and pack your go bag. And, so there were all of these different levels that we had that we paid no attention to, of course, because who was going to need this? And then all of a sudden this happened. But so during all of this time, we would go back and forth during, on these DEFCON levels. And, we didn't really pay that much attention because one of the things was, it's like, we felt very safe in our villages and towns and cities. I lived in Donetsk, which was in the east, which is actually where the president was from. So there was, everybody was happy as a clam over where I was. And the people that were protesting were more in the West because they were more aligned with the EU. But we were kind of going through these DEFCON levels, and I was, as the responsible adult in the crowd, I was the warden, the security warden for my state. So if you think about like the state of Minnesota, there were, I think, 12 or 16 volunteers living in my state. And so I was kind of loosely responsible for them and making sure that they knew what was going on and where they were supposed to be. And if anything happened, I lived in a big city and it was like we had an airport there and lots of good transportation there. So I was going to be the place that people would evacuate to if we needed to. And so that was my job. And so we were kind of going through these different levels there. And a couple of times we were, told to pack our bags. And, we're just like, yeah, we don't need to do that. And then once it got towards the end here of February, I'm like, oh, this is kind of starting to feel differently. I think we probably should start getting ourselves, organized to go. And then, yeah, so here's a picture of back then, the riots, the Orthodox priests trying to kind of keep the peace, really powerful images that were coming out of that protest from the 18th to 20th, more than 80 were killed. So things really started to get violent in a big way. And so this is when we were basically, President Yanukovych evacuated Ukraine. He left, escaped to Russia right after the last Olympics or the Sochi Olympics. He left, and then right thereafter, we were told that we would be, they were told to come to my house as I can't remember what the term was, but they didn't know they were leaving the country yet, but they were supposed to bring a go bag and come to my flat. And so I had in basically my 1-room, 2-room flat, I had, I think 12 or 16 people living with me in all various states of trauma, because a lot of them were young. They had boyfriends, they had girlfriends, they had pets, they had all kinds of stuff that they were leaving behind. We couldn't tell people, we weren't supposed to tell anybody that once we found out we were evacuating, we weren't supposed to tell anybody that we were evacuating until everybody was safely out of the country. And so tears and drama and all kinds of stuff was going on, in addition to just being shoved into a tiny flat. But this is what we did. I've never been so tired and exhausted in my life as I was here. We managed, during this time, Peace Corps arranged for, so for us, we had an airport, an international airport in my city. So they just flew us out to Istanbul and onto Washington, D.C. Others from the area came in that way too. Some of the people went overland, to Moldova, maybe was the closest border. There was kind of a hodgepodge of how people left. We had a couple of people that didn't leave. One of them I think he was engaged. I don't think he was married yet, but he was engaged to a Ukrainian woman. And so he basically just severed his ties to Peace Corps and stayed in Ukraine with her. It was kind of a hodgepodge of things. And so we basically got evacuated back to Washington, D.C. And the first person who talked to us, we went to a big conference center there because there was 220 of us. The first person that came to talk to us was the head of security for Peace Corps, because there was a lot of people that were very angry about getting evacuated because they felt completely safe. And so the head of security came and talked to us about why we were evacuated. And one of the main things that I remember him saying was the protests and the violence was starting to impact the transportation network. And so they were starting to, maybe bomb, trains or, train tracks, which was then narrowing the ability to evacuate. And so that was the first thing they said was if transportation is disrupted, then we're going to pull you out, because, if we lose that opportunity to pull you out, then, you're going to be stuck there. And then they also talked about, just kind of the escalating violence and, it's way too big of a coincidence that we were evacuated 2 days before Putin invaded Crimea. So I think they did have some intelligence where that was going to happen. I'm sure they did. They didn't tell us that, but I'm sure that was the case. So yeah, we were evacuated on the 24th, and the airport in Crimea was taken on the 28th. So, and there were probably 10 or 12 Peace Corps volunteers that were stationed in Crimea. And many, when we evacuated, flew out of that airport. So it was that tight of a time frame by the time, we got out, and then the invasion happened. So that happened on the 28th. And then on March 16th is when they had their referendum to annex Crimea to Russia. The way that referendum passed is that they went around and the soldiers confiscated the passports of anybody who was not going to vote for the referendum. So to think that it was a fair vote is mistaken, but yeah, so that is what happened there. And so Russian troops amassed at the borders. Sound familiar to anybody of local news? They were proposing a federation so that regions would have autonomy from Kyiv, mostly in the east. And, there has been Russian volunteers assisting the Ukrainian sympathizers ever since in the east, and it's just even more so now. And, there has been an ongoing war in the east since 2014. Taken on a little bit of a different flavor now, but many well, I shouldn't say many, I could say almost all of the people that I knew in Donetsk, where I lived, evacuated shortly after I did and have not been able to go back to their homes since 2014. So they went from Donetsk, and most of them lived in Kyiv. Some of them left. A couple of them went to Russia. A couple of them moved to Germany. Most of them moved to Kyiv. And the comment, I checked in with them shortly after all of this started happening. And I'm just like, are you okay? Where are you? Do you need anything? And one of them said, I guess we're just destined to be refugees, because they left their house in they left their homes in Donetsk, everything behind. Now they're having to do it again. So super, super sad. But, what started as a disagreement between aligning more with the EU versus Russia has now become a struggle to simply keep Ukraine together. This is what I wrote, for presentations back in, like, when I came back in 2014 and 2015, and I was going to update it. And I'm just like, well, but it's kind of the same. I mean, it's the same situation. Only 8 years later, Putin seems to be intent on creating instability such that the new government will fail. It's not that different, and now he's, kind of this picture of him cutting Ukraine in half. Now he's, deciding that he's just going to go for the East, supposedly. But yeah, it's horrible. And people are, we can talk more about it. I don't understand, if you look at that map, and the blue part was sympathetic to Russia. They're very aligned culturally to Russia. They speak Russian, and he's blowing it to bits. I don't understand why he thinks that this is going to be benefiting him. But nonetheless, before we get into that topic, I did want to share with you some pictures of what my Ukraine looked like, and how, like, some of my favorite photos of when I was there. So this is a picture in Donetsk it's called the Park of Forged Figures. Where I lived, it was an iron producing region, and a lot of iron manufacturing was there. And so they would have actually a festival every year of iron makers, artists that would come with their forges and create pieces. This park I got to walk through every day on my way to and from work. And there's just all kinds of different iron art pieces there that were just lovely. One of my favorite places ever was this park, and in all of its different seasons and all of the different fun art pieces there. Donetsk was known as the City of Roses. There was tons of rose bushes and lovely parks there. It was great. This is a picture of some pictures of their botanical garden that was there. Here is, my city of Donetsk at war. So back in 2012, Ukraine and Poland hosted Euro Cup, which is the big soccer tournament in Europe. And one of the oligarchs, one of the richest men in Ukraine, corrupt as all get out, but one of the oligarchs was from my city. And so he built this huge state-of-the-art football stadium. I was probably just 3 blocks away from here. And this is what it looked like. It was one of the things that was bombed out in the war in 2014. And this is what it looked like shortly thereafter. So this was just 2 years apart. Bombed out the airport. They had built a brand new airport to support the Euro Cup tournaments. Bombed that out. Just totally awful. Here's a picture of their trains and some of my train station. Here was a little lady that was bound and determined to talk to me on this train trip, even though I couldn't speak any Russian, hardly. I mean, I tried. She couldn't speak any English, but we had a conversation the whole time that we had the train trip. So that was actually kind of fun. I thought this was a great picture of the little ladies in their fur coats getting ready to hop on the local bus. And some of the kind of the difference between some of the dilapidated old buses that were around and then some of the fresh new ones that were coming around. So they were making some progress. Here's a picture of Victory Day, similar to our Veterans and Memorial Days. The pride that people had, the kids would line the street and give the veterans flowers. And here's an old guy kind of with the day and the celebration that was happening there. And if you kind of stay tuned to this May 9th date, I think I saw something in the paper today that was the day Putin was going to leverage to go all in on the war. He was going to do a mass mobilization, it sounded like, of his army. And so this May 9th day, I think, is the day that he was talking about doing that, because it is a day of national pride and military strength. So keep an eye out for that. This is a picture of Kyiv in better days. So beautiful tulips in the springtime. One of the many onion dome churches that are around. Here's a picture of Crimea, one of the iconic pictures of Crimea, the swallow's nest. And then here's another picture of Crimea as well. Great. For those of you familiar, there's a great Tatar culture there. The most fabulous lagman soup in the world was there when I was there. Maybe it was also, I was just super hungry, but super delicious. Yeah, during the USSR, they drove the Tatar people out of this region and relocated them into Uzbekistan and some of the other areas because it is so lovely and all of the Russians wanted to live there. And they were just starting to move themselves back, reclaim their lands, reestablish their culture. And now this happened. So super sad about that. Chernihiv, which might be another town that you're familiar hearing about in the news. This is the town that we had our training in. It is between Kyiv and Belarus. It was one of the main cities that got annihilated as the Russians came in from Belarus down into Kyiv. Chernihiv, if it's an HIV at the end, it's just the Ukrainian way of saying it. But this is what the city looked like when I was there. And it's just had it's taken a terrible toll during this most recent war. And then here's what the West looks like, the Carpathian Mountains, and there's castles and green and rolling hills and this, rich farmland that we had. So really, really great and beautiful country. So vapros, questions. I'll stop sharing and put myself back on thing. We can talk about any and all of what you have here.
Thanks, Dawn. Really, really sobering and upsetting and sad. So
yeah.
Christine, do you have a question? You have yourself off of mute.
I know. I have just kind of a dumb question. I have kind of just a dumb question. So are you visualizing Putin going in, destroying everything, and then rebuilding it? So it's beautiful in his name? I mean, what?
I don't know. What they say is he thought that, it's not going as he planned, right? He thought that he would be, they would be laying roses down in front of the tanks and welcoming him to, welcoming the Russians to save them from this government. So I don't think he has a plan. In my opinion, he thought he would just be able to, swoop in and everything would be fine. I think he's being very protected. People aren't telling, his inner circle is telling him what he wants to hear instead of what reality is. What I can tell you is that he will not lose. He's not going to lose the war. So, unless they can find a way to give him, let him save face and give him an off ramp to say that he won, I really don't know what's going to happen, because he's not going to allow himself to lose.
You've heard no chatter of a coup at all?
No.
Circle, having enough of him?
I wish. I think that would be helpful, but no, I haven't heard anything. And I think he's so, like, if you see pictures of him, he's on one end of a 50-foot long table and everybody else is over here, down here talking to him. I think he's so isolated, like even from the pandemic, but then also, just in the sense of security. I think he's just kind of lost his sense of reality, frankly. But he really, really hates the idea of Ukraine going towards Europe. You know, he just hates it. So.
Stephanie?
Yeah, Dawn, it's just fascinating. Your photos were beautiful. So the western half, or more than half, is it just beautiful and green and untouched? Is it okay?
It's not, I mean, is it okay now, you mean?
Yeah, right now, we're seeing all these horrible images.
Yeah.
And then, all the refugees and they're walking to, other countries.
Yeah.
Is the western half, is life kind of normal?
I don't know about normal. Like, I did see that they were starting to bomb, do some bombing in Lviv, which is, on the far west, a gorgeous city, very European city. A lot of the refugees are, in the country. They go to the dachas, which, if you've heard the word dachas, that's kind of like our lake place, only they have these places in the country. And so a lot of the people that are evacuating from Kyiv are, if they have a place to go out in the country, that's where they are. Because one of the main things is that they're not letting the men leave, so if you're, I think, younger than 65 or 60, they're not letting you leave. So, unless the women and the children are, okay, I mean, they're just kind of moving them out into these, the little villages. Certainly they don't have tanks running through there yet. So it's probably a lot more okay than definitely the East and the Northeast and the East. But I'm sure that they're suffering, food shortages and transportation disruptions and all of that kind of stuff. Yeah. Like they were talking about, I saw something the other day about, now is the time that everybody's supposed to be planting their crops. And, who's planting their crops right now, and what that downstream effect is going to be. It was a guy from, I think he was on 60 Minutes, actually. He runs the World Food Program or something and they were just talking about how much they depend on Ukraine and their exports for food, for the rest of the world. And these guys are supposed to be planting their crops right now, and they're not, and what that is going to mean for everyone.
Thanks, Stephanie. Jane, and then Greg.
I was wondering, Dawn, Zelensky is portrayed as a hero in the West. How is he perceived actually in Ukraine?
One of the things that isn't he looking old, by the way? It's like, wow, I saw a side-by-side picture of him, at the beginning, and now, poor guy. But, one of the things that I think is so amazing about him is that he did not leave. He had stayed there, and he, I think, I haven't specifically talked to anybody about it. I just have kind of been checking in to make sure they're personally okay. I haven't but I have to believe that that counts for something with them, because they are so used to having people abandon them, and to see what he's doing has got to be building credibility for him. And I actually even thought, I'm just like, if they can get through this, they might be able to break, what does it take to break the cycle of corruption? How, and it's like, this guy might be able to do it if he is able to pull this off. And so I have to believe that he is certainly got a lot more credibility than any of the other presidents that they had. Because they would have taken the money and run. They would have taken the ride as Biden, that Biden offered, for sure.
Thank you. Greg?
Dawn, I got to tell you, this is a fascinating discussion. I mean, my goodness, and how timely and how sad the whole thing is. I've only met personally one Ukrainian, contemporary Ukrainian, younger than me, and it was a Russian ethnic or Russian speaking Ukrainian. And he just spoke with such high contempt of the Ukrainian speaking Ukrainians. And he was very glad that the Russians had come in and et cetera. And just like, and he referred to the Ukrainian speakers, the Ukrainians, as those people, and those people are worthless. You're in a Russian speaking section of the country. I'm surprised to hear, glad to hear, I think, that the people who left that part as refugees went to the Ukraine, not to Russia.
There were some that went to Russia too.
So yes, okay. I mean, did those people, your neighbors, the people you dealt with in Peace Corps, do they want to be part of the Ukraine? Do they want or be part of Ukraine? Do they want to go to Russia? They want that territory to become Russian? What was their desire?
Where I was, it was split. They didn't like talking about politics, and so I had a hard time getting them to talk about politics. But there was, I mean, it was exactly what you, I mean, there were a group of people that wanted to, even though Russian was their mother tongue, they live in Ukraine, they felt Ukrainian, they wanted it to stay Ukrainian. They thought it could all be worked out, you know, like everything. And then there was this faction of people that, yeah, you know, they wanted to go back to Russia because they, you know, especially the older people, because, you know, they wanted, you know, I mean, being independent is hard, you know, being taken care of, where it's like you get your turn and they give you your apartment and, you know, they give you your allotment and they tell you what to do. And I mean, that's what they know. That's what they were comfortable with. It was easy. And, you know, and just like, if you look around, the Twin Cities, you're going to have all kinds of different versions of what they want, you know, even when Trump and, you know, with Trump was in office, there were people that were absolutely pro-Trump and, you know, not, but they all considered themselves Americans. So it was the gamut, but definitely more Russian sympathy, and people aligning with Russian where I lived, for sure. I mean, it wasn't a slam dunk by any means. There were people that thought that was a good thing.
If I may follow up, was everybody, were people ethnic Russians? The reason I'm asking this is I saw a report recently on Mariupol. Excuse me, got a cough, saw it the wrong way. And while the people who lived in Mariupol were Russian speaking, most of the people in Mariupol were ethnic Greek. And so the Russian the Russians who are bombing Mariupol, they really don't care. Oh, they speak Russian, who cares? They're Greek, we're going to kill them. And so the people around you, were they ethnic Russians or do they speak Russian because that was the convenience? Yep.
There were a lot of people around me that had relatives from Russia, or they had connections there. Like the woman who headed up the organization that I worked at, she went to college in St. Petersburg. They had, you know, there were Russian relatives somewhere, maybe not immediate, but, you know, aunts and uncles or whatever. So there was a lot of ties, you know, cultural ties there for sure.
Interesting. Thank you.
Yep.
Thanks, Greg. Hey, I'm going to share the four-way test on. We end our meetings with the four-way test, and then we can stick around for a couple of final questions if you have time, and send people on their way. Everyone can take themselves off of mute, please. The Rotary four-way test of the things we think, say, and do. Is it
the truth?
Truth.
Is it
fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill
and better
friendships?
friendships?
And will
Will it be beneficial to all concerned?
concerned? Thank you. And Dawn, I have a kind of a final question. Current situation or your situation and evacuation notwithstanding, would you recommend Peace Corps? I mean, overall, was it positive? Did you like it? Is it something that, as some of us approach, whatever, the age of 65, that older group, you know, is that something that you would recommend?
You know, I would. It was not what I expected, but it was rewarding in its own way, and it's getting more and more rewarding. Kind of the being in it,
Mhm.
and being, and now being away from it. They said, what do they say? Go to your site and make a 2-month plan, and then make that your 2-year plan. And then,
Right. Yeah, right.
and that's kind of, if you go in with that mindset where, it's not your timetable, it's their timetable, and,
Right.
you will be fine. I think, we come and we think we can do so much good so quickly, and then, you kind of have to remember your place. But yes, absolutely, I would recommend Peace Corps for sure.
Sounds good. If everyone can give Dawn a really nice round of applause. This is just a
Thank you for
wonderful
listening.
presentation. Thank you for joining us and being here, and just super timely. And I think I personally will focus on the news about Ukraine a little differently than I did before this presentation. So I really appreciate that.
Absolutely.
Any final questions at all? Comments? Yeah, Olga.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much for all of this and really sharing more about that history and your insights and your experiences of being there, because, well, what do we know, right?
Yeah.
We have trusted sources, and that's what we follow. My family is in Western Europe, and they have a very heightened concern about all of this. We all on this call are concerned, but it's a different level. But I also have, well, it's not officially a daughter-in-law, but my oldest son's girlfriend, and they live together. She is from Russia, and we cannot talk about this. Her sources are different, the sources that she trusts and her family. And she's the sweetest, most caring young lady you can think of. This is not someone who says, sure, kill them all. No, right. She's absolutely super friendly and caring. She's a registered nurse. She loves her pets. She's just wonderful person, but trusts different sources because she and her family are from Russia, and she grew up here in the US, but still, right? So your story has helped me a little bit with understanding there are some different perspectives on it. But do you know anything about how the people of Russia are informed about this war? From your perspective, what do you see or hear about that source?
Yeah, I don't know anything other than probably what I've heard in the news, which is, Russia owns the news sources. And so you can curate, whatever news that you want to there. I'm surprised that if she lives in the United States, I mean, she's got to be exposed to, the other side of the coin.
Right.
Yeah.
But like we had, in a way, I thought of it, that we had very different opinions during this last presidential election, right? We could pick and choose whatever we wanted to watch and follow, and still people had very strong different opinions. Now, she's much more exposed to what we watch, right, on this call, right. And still there's that that little thing of trust.
Right. It's interesting. I maybe would, if you ever did get a chance to talk to her, I would maybe, but just ask her perspective. I mean, it's a different culture, it's a different thing, and maybe see if you can get her to talk about it and why, why she thinks it, it's supportive. And I mean, because it's like all about pro-Russia and their like perspective on it. And I would maybe just ask her for her opinion and like her perspective and see what she says, and don't judge, don't argue, don't anything, just take it in.
Right.
Because it probably is kind of tied back to some of that, kind of some of that, they're trying to, Europe is trying to attack them, trying to change them into somebody that they're not. I don't know. Like I said,
right.
Because it is really all about, they're just very threatened by Europe. It's all about that, but there's a lot of that. They don't, and like, one of the things that I heard was, so Russia, or, Putin and Russia has their, you know, how they have their economy, and if Ukraine starts getting more freedoms and more, you know, if they are better off financially and they have more freedoms and they have more things, and there is very close ties, and it's like if the Russians start seeing this and it's like, well, I want some of that action, then there's going to be, you know, turmoil in Russia. And so, you know, he's got a vested, you know, desire to kind of keep a lid on that. Who knows? The guy's cuckoo, but but yeah, because that's what I think too. Is like, you know, there are Russians that are buying into the story.
Right. Well, thank you so much. Yeah.
Absolutely.
I may just kick in one thing. It's not just Putin. It could be also Russia. When I was an exchange student in 1969, and there were 4 exchange students in our town, 1 went home, so 3 exchange students. There was 1 Rotarian. He had a fast car, and his only job for us was if the Russians decided to move. And remember, Prague had been invaded just 14 months before I became an exchange student. His job was to get us to the border, either to Norway, to Denmark, but immediately. And we lived in fear of the Russians the entire time. And the Swedes did. I was in Sweden. And the Swedes lived in fear of the Russian bear all the time. They always referred to it as the Russian bear. And I was just talking to my friend Jake in Western Finland last week. He's really nervous. You know, he said to me, "Greg, am I and my family, are we going to become refugees? Are we going to have to flee from Finland?" I said, "Well, you know, I don't know, but boy, I sure hope not." People are really afraid of Russia.
Yeah. I mean, this concept of, you know, invading a sovereign country, invading the borders of a sovereign country because you think you can, is just like, who does that? Who does that? It's like, the borders are there. They've been there since 1991. Okay, you clearly don't agree with them, but do you just have license to just come on in and take it? It's like, who does that? And it's in Europe, for crying out loud.
So.
It's amazing. I don't know.